Hello there, everyone. I am Aaron St. Dennis, the FF Mad Scientist, and this is the Mad Science Lab podcast. Today, we are going to be continuing on with some studs and duds, and here to help me with that is Geoff Lambert. Geoff, thank you for joining me. It's a pleasure to have you.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
Would you like to take a quick second here? Tell everyone where they can find you and your work.
Absolutely. You can find me on Twitter at Geoff Lambert77. I'm the founder of goingfor2.com. We got a bunch of writers there that cover Dynasty and Redraft and Daily Fantasy. And we have a podcast network on YouTube. You can find it at Going for Two Live. We got shows pretty much every day of the week. Not all of it's fantasy related. Some of it's pop culture stuff, and some of it's just general sports. But we got something for everybody on the network.
Awesome. Sounds like you're doing great work. Pleasure to have you.
Thanks for having me.
All right, let's get into our first one here. We have Seattle receiver DK Metcalf. Finished as wide receiver 16 last year, 1,048 receiving yards with 6 TDs, 207.3 full PPR points, good for 13.28 per game. Current Fantasy Pros ADP is 28 overall. We will switch over my little screen here and see where he is among the wide receivers on Underdog, because that's what you're using. Current ADP is 28.7 on Underdog, so he is about the same everywhere. Is he a stud or a dud for you?
Oh, he's definitely a stud for me. I mean, this guy last year, I know we're all down on him. He supposedly didn't have a great season, but he had a career high in targets, a career high in catches. He still had 1,000 yards. You know, he's a little bit down on his yards per catch last year, and only had 6 touchdowns, despite being 7th in the league last year with 22 red zone targets. I think that's something that's going to change this year. I think he does get into the end zone a lot more, and if he can continue those high target rates, high catch rates, and gets back to being a big play guy, which we didn't see too much of last year, I think he definitely is going to be rising up quite a bit here from where he is being drafted currently. I think the issue with his red zone last year was just the fact that he just didn't catch many of them. He had 22 red zone targets. He only caught 9 of them. I don't know if it was Geno Smith or if it was whatever it was, but it was the worst in the top 24. His percentage of catches in the red zone. So if that changes at all, which I do expect it to this year, I think his value where he's being ranked right now is 28th overall is just way too low.
I find myself having a lot of shares of DK Metcalf early on, not even because I'm a huge believer, but if you can see this ADP right here on Underdog, it's because where he falls. He's roughly, what is that, wide receiver? Yep, wide receiver 15. I don't mind a few of the guys after Cooper and maybe more, but if you look right here, look at the guys above him, and then look right here, that's called a cliff. It falls right off the cliff, and it's into Neverland there. And I have a ton of DK Metcalf in any league where I am lacking at wide receiver, which in that range, it's normally most of them. Like I said, he's the last-ditch effort for me, and I want nothing to do with the guys after him. Ridley, Debo, Keenan Allen, Watson, Judy. So I've been stacking him up pretty much everywhere I can get him. What are your thoughts about, this range and about wide receiver 15 to 20 here?
Yeah, so I think if you look at just the receivers, I think he's probably right where he should be. I mean, I might have him over T. Higgins, Devonta Smith, just because they're the receiver 2 on their team, where I think he's still the receiver 1. But as far as, where he is overall, at least according to Underdog, he is he's being drafted after the quarterbacks. Jalen Hurts, Josh Allen are going ahead of him. And to me, I don't draft my quarterbacks early. And if I'm taking a stud receiver, after those quarterbacks, I think you're doing it wrong personally.
Yeah, he is. Okay, won't work on me. There we go. Current ADP, I just seen him. Yep, 28.7. So you're right. In that range, he goes after Hurts, Allen, Ramondre, Jacobs, goes just before Mark Andrews, Breece Hall, and then the receivers in his range. So you're right. He's kind of sandwiched in there with some quarterbacks, the last really of this early running backs. Like I said, that's just a range where unless I really decide I want Hurts or Allen, I've just gone DK, and I have a ton of them so far.
Yeah, and I think he's one of those players too that you get in this range sometimes, and you got the guys that are very consistent, which like the T Higgins, obviously he's a very consistent player. At the end of the year, his point total is going to be in that same range as DK, but DK will give you those week winning games where he'll just go and have a monster game. I know, obviously not part of fantasy points, but last year, if you look at the game he had against the 49ers in the playoffs. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but it's like 11 catches, over 100 yards. I think he had a couple touchdowns. I mean, he was just a beast. I know as a Niners fan that he killed us in that playoff game, and that's the kind of games he can give you in the regular season as well.
Looking that up, that would be the Niners. Was that last year?
Should have been last year, yeah.
What am I showing here? 2022. I am not sure. You sure it was against the Niners? I'm showing he put up 14 against the Niners. You thinking maybe I see a 30-point game against the Rams in week 13?
Well, it would have been.
You said playoffs. Okay.
Yeah,
I thought you meant fantasy playoffs. Yeah. You're right. Okay. He's still, even though he ended the season on a tear here, going into the fantasy playoffs, 21.5, 15, 18, 24, 30, 21, 18. So he went on quite a tear there. You're right. The ceiling's definitely there. All right. Who would you like next?
Let's go to Najee Harris.
Najee. That's someone I don't think I've talked about too much. Everyone seems to hate him after last year. We have Pittsburgh running back Najee Harris, finished as RB14 last year in full PPR, 1,038 rushing yards, 229 through the air, 10 touchdowns, 227.86 PPR points, good for 13.11 per game. Fantasy Pros ADP is 37 overall. He is actually 37 overall on Underdog, so that's another one that's in line. RB12 currently. Is he a stud or a dud for you?
He's also a stud for me as well. And again, similar to DK, I'm not too worried about his positional ranking. He's RB12 on Underdog. It's probably where I might have him. But when you look at who he's going up against in the overall, he's going after Mark Andrews, Keenan Allen, Calvin Ridley, Debo, Amari, after Lamar Jackson.
Yeah.
But if you look last year, he came into the season not real healthy. He had that Liz Frank injury that kind of scared everybody. In his first half of the season, he was not very good. But if you look after week 10, so he had his bye week in week 9, came back in week 10. From week 10 to week 18, he was the RB7. And if you want to not include week 18, because this doesn't include fantasy, if you go week 10 to week 17, he was still the RB8. So not much of a drop off there. Still had over 1,200 all-purpose yards and 10 total touchdowns. And I don't know where the hate's coming from. The biggest issue with him last year was his targets. His targets, I think, almost got cut in half last year compared to his rookie season when he was, I think, RB6 or RB5. And that's because the offensive line was terrible. They were asking him to pass block a lot more than he was pass blocking in his rookie season. So those checkdowns weren't there because he was blocking. I think the offensive line has improved a little bit. I think Pickett as a quarterback takes a step forward. I think he'll be looking for Najee Harris underneath a lot more often. And I know people are worried about Jaylen Warren being a little bit of a bugaboo there. And I do think he'll get his work in there. He played too well not to. But Tomlin traditionally likes a one running back backfield, always has. And I think Najee Harris is the guy that can pretty much do it all. I mean, he can be on the field the entire time. So I think Najee Harris, where he's being drafted in the overall sense, I think is way too low. I think he has the ability to be a top half of the top 12. He could be an RB6, RB7. Being currently ranked as the RB12 is probably where I'd still have him ranked. But overall, I think I would have him much higher than some of the guys ahead of him.
I know exactly what's going on with Najee Harris. I had a league last year that I managed. Well, I drafted a team with a friend of mine who's in a big money league, doesn't really know much about it. We used a high pick on Najee. By week 8, the managers in his league were ridiculing him, and he could not give Najee Harris away. Yep. So everybody who also owned Najee hates him and is out on him. I, have a little bit of experience and got him to hold on, and Najee was around long enough to carry us to a fantasy title. Yep. So for the people who were patient and held Najee through the duration, they got to reap the benefits of what you said, him finishing, would you say RB7, RB8 towards the end?
Somewhere in that range, yep.
Yeah, whereas everybody else who bailed, they didn't see the good weeks. They bailed at week 8, and as far as they know, he was an outside the top 40 running back, and they want nothing to do with him. that works for me. People are going to overcorrect here based on their hatred. He's going to slip in drafts, although RB12 is not really slipping that much, but I'm going to take the discount, and I like Najee Harris myself. That's exactly what I want.
I think it's funny because last year at this time, if you would ask me the same question, I was actually out on Najee Harris at his current ADP. He was going too high. And I think now the pendulum has swung so far the other direction. I'm like, okay, now I can buy Najee Harris. He's a little bit too cheap now. So I think he's going to swing back the other direction.
I'm right on board with you, and that's the irony. In that league, it was a keeper league, and we didn't keep a running back, and he was one of the best ones. And I got there and I said, I don't like Najee. I hate this ADP, but in a keeper league where, a lot of the best options are gone, I said, screw it, just take Najee Harris. And he regretted it for most of the season until it carried us to a title. Like I said, I love when they overcorrect on these players. Just the ones that are, I see it even if we scroll down a bit. Jerry Jeudy's someone that people are just out on. I find myself gravitating back. Same with Deontay Johnson, Brandon Ayuk, Tyler Lockett. These players where, managers have just gotten so carried away that now they're cheap and they can't help but outproduce their ADP. And that's what I want.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned Deontay Johnson because he was one of the guys I almost put on my stud list as well because I think he broke an NFL record last year at the 147 targets in no touchdowns. That's something that just can't happen again. He's going to get the targets.
Absolutely did. Yeah, he was. So last year with a rookie quarterback and no touchdowns, he finished as wide receiver 30. He's currently being drafted as wide receiver 33. So even in the worst case scenario, he outperformed that ADP slightly.
Yep.
It's just not possible, but I don't know how I've gotten back on Najee. Watson or Ridley?
Let's do Watson.
I'm really glad you saved Ridley for last. I just came off of a podcast where they drafted Ridley in their mock draft and they both loved him. I am about as anti-Ridley as it gets, but let's go with Christian Watson, Green Bay wide receiver, finished as wide receiver 41, missed significant time, 80 rushing yards, 611 receiving yards with 9 touchdowns. I'm pretty sure you can figure out what his case is going to be for a dud. 164.5 fantasy points in PPR, good for 11.72 per game. Current Fantasy Pros ADP is 39. I feel like, yep, he's right down there at 40 or 38. What's the difference here? Trying to figure. Oh, current ADP. Sorry. So he's gone down 1 to 40, finishing as wide receiver 20. I am completely out. If I'll let you talk, but I'm going to switch over at a second here to the wide receivers. And when you see the wide receivers going in his range, you'll know why I am out. What is it for you?
Well, it's funny that we just talked about Deontay Johnson and his tons of targets and his lack of touchdowns. This guy is exactly the opposite. Not a lot of targets, has those 9 touchdowns, had a game where he had 3 touchdowns in one game. And that skews his overall numbers for the season that everybody keeps looking at like, oh, this is what he's going to be able to do for the entire season. And I'm just not buying it. He's got obviously a new quarterback who we don't really know if he's going to be any good or not. The Packers went out and drafted 2 pass-catching tight ends. They drafted another receiver in Dontavian Wicks. Dobbs is still there.
Jaden Reed.
I'm sorry. Yeah, both of those guys, Jaden Reed and Dontavian Wicks are both there. He never had more than 8 targets in a game, and he only did that twice. And it's one of those things where like you see his year-end numbers and you go, oh man, he had a really good season. But when you actually break it down, he had 3 good games. He had a stretch of 3 good games that carried his entire season. And people want to take those 3 games and extrapolate it over a full season. I just don't see it happening. I don't see how it's possible.
No, my case for passing on Watson is simple. If you look, 40.3 overall. I can wait 13, 18 picks down here, like Deontay Johnson at 63, Lockett at 64, Ayuk even at 51. Why would I use a 4th round pick on Christian Watson? There's like the ones above him, like I don't like Debo at all, but I'd still rather take Debo. But on this list of receivers, if you can see it, I don't think there's another player on here that I wouldn't take over Christian Watson. From wide receiver 16 to 31 here, you can see the screen. Is there anyone on here you'd take over Watson?
No. Actually, I'll be dropping him down quite a bit on that list for sure.
Or sorry, you wouldn't take over Watson is what I meant. I
Right.
assume Watson would be. So you're saying basically, even though he is wide receiver 20, he's probably outside wide receiver 30 for you as well, huh?
At least, yeah, at least looking at that list. Mike
Yeah.
Williams, maybe. I'm not a big Mike Williams fan, so maybe
Right.
that'd be the one. But yeah, overall, I don't think there's much on that list.
Even look at the early 30s: Pittman, Deontay, Lockett, Evans, some high upside young guys here with JSN, Burks, Addison, Dotson, Pickens, Quentin Johnson. Like, I don't see how he's going so high. Who is it who's taking him at 40 overall? It's not me.
Yeah, definitely not. And like I mentioned, the quarterback change too. I mean, they're going to want to run the ball and be conservative. So they don't have Aaron Rodgers anymore. I know he didn't have a great season last year, but he's still one of the best quarterbacks to ever play the game. And they're not going to put the ball into to Love's hand enough to really benefit Christian Watson, I don't believe.
Yeah, I suspect that Jordan Love isn't going to have the same touchdown rate as Aaron Rodgers, even in his worst year. So once again, we have turned the Mad Science Lab podcast into the Calvin Ridley show, the player it seems I talk about every single episode. I'm glad that every once in a while he comes up on someone's stud list. I'm glad he's on your dud list. We have Jacksonville. Still seems weird saying that. Jacksonville wide receiver Calvin Ridley. The stats you see on the board are from 2020. He was suspended all of last year. 2021, he only played 5 games between mental health and injury. He was wide receiver 5 that year. 1,374 receiving yards for 9 touchdowns, 268 PPR points for 17.87 per game. Currently, Fantasy Pros 32 overall. I still have the wide receivers up here. So he is wide receiver 16 on Underdog and also going 32 overall. And like I said, he is the first player in this abyss of wide receivers that I want nothing to do with. I never draft the top player in a tier. So when it gets to the Calvin Ridley section in the draft for me, I'm just going to be pivoting to another position. Why is it you're out on Calvin Ridley?
So if you look at last season, I mean, chemistry is something to be said in the NFL, and the guys just have that connection. And him and Christian Kirk had that connection last year. I don't see Ridley coming in and taking any shares of Christian Kirk and what he did last year. Evan Ingram was a really good player for them last year. Zay Jones had a really good rapport with him. ETN even caught passes out of the backfield. I just don't see where there's a big enough piece of the pie for Calvin Ridley to come in and be what they expect him to be at this ADP, as far as fantasy owners expect him to be. He essentially, like you mentioned, he had 2 seasons off, and we've seen players come back from 2 seasons off before, and they're just not good their first year. It's hard to come back from 2 years of not playing professional football and just jump in and be a top 16 receiver? Is that what we said? Top
16 exactly.
Yeah, that's just not something that's I just don't see happening. I think that they're going to spread the ball around quite a bit. I think Christian Kirk still gets his, Evan Ingram still gets his. Will Ridley be a bad receiver? Absolutely not. He just won't be the receiver 16 in this offense. He just won't have a big enough piece of the pie to do that.
Well, the argument for the people who are in on Ridley, sorry, we had a background interruption. The argument for people who are in on Ridley seems to be the Michael Thomas argument, where they say, oh, well, Thomas missed 2 years, but that was injury. This isn't. Well, Deshaun Watson missed 2 years, and it was an injury, and he sucked last year. And I would argue that quarterback is more about the mental, and I think it would be easier for Deshaun Watson to have made a return after 2 years than Calvin Ridley. Calvin Ridley's not like a Cooper Kupp, a slot receiver. He's a bigger alpha type receiver. These guys, he's almost 28 or almost 29. He will be in season. These guys don't typically age well. So I'm not sure almost 2 full years off is going to have been great to Calvin Ridley. I would prefer, like, Calvin Ridley's going as 32 overall. I think I would rather Christian Kirk at 48 overall.
Absolutely.
If you're going to have a member of the Jags offense, and like I said, Calvin Ridley has been the poster child for this wide receiver cliff for me at wide receiver 15 overall, and I have none of these guys. Ridley, Debo. I have a few Cooper, but Keenan Allen, Watson, Judy. I just don't want any of them. So what are your thoughts on, Calvin Ridley in that area?
So you just kind of to expand upon the 2 years off. It's not only is it 2 years off, if it was 2 years off and he's coming back to the Atlanta Falcons and Matt Ryan's his quarterback and they already had that rapport, different story. He's taken 2 years off, changed teams, changed quarterbacks, changes offense, has a different dynamic in the offense. So it's more than just losing 2 years. He has to, sort of learn his offense again, sort of learn his quarterback and build that rapport all over again. A guy like Cooper Kupp, like you mentioned, who missed a full year, he came back with the same situation basically. So he was able to pick up where he left off. Whereas this is not the same thing. Receivers sometimes struggle just in general by changing teams to new teams to sort of acclimate. So he's trying to do both, come back from 2 years being off and acclimate himself to a new team and a new quarterback.
Yeah. And not only the loss of, not having Matt Ryan anymore, but an underrated part is his most productive years, the number one corner was on Julio Jones, not him. The number one corner is going to be on him this year, not Christian Kirk. So he's going to face better competition than he ever has because he's not going to have the alpha on the other side, the Hall of Famer, to draw coverage. Even they're double teaming Julio out there, leaving him open to run down the field. So I agree. I'm on board, I think, with all 4 of your studs and your duds. So, all right, Geoff. Well, thank you for joining me. You want to take another chance here to run through where everyone can find you?
Yeah, absolutely. Find me at Geoff Lambert 77 on Twitter. And then, of course, goingfor2.com is the website. You can also visit Going for Two Live on YouTube. We got, obviously shows every single night. And it's also a podcast as well. It's in audio, so you can find it on iTunes, Spotify, the whole nine. So thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it. And this was a lot of fun.
I'm not going to lie. Your green screen background game is elite. You have easily the best background I've seen. The only one that was even close, I was on a podcast the other day and the guy had it set up like he was at a New York Rangers press conference, but yours was so good for a second there. If you had moved back in that chair, I would have thought you were at that news desk. It's elite. It looks great. So
thank you.
Well, thanks, Geoff. It was great talking to you. Thank you for joining me.
Appreciate it, man. Thanks for having me on.
This has been Studs and Duds with Geoff Lambert. Once again, I am Aaron St. Dennis, the FF Mad Scientist, and this has been the Mad Science Lab podcast. Thanks again to Geoff for joining me, and thank you all for watching. Have a good night.